did America go from pilgrims coming over here, seeking freedom to express their Judeo-Christian beliefs, to today's discrimination against those beliefs and calling it tolerance? It's like we got a disconnect. They came over here, they were Christians, they wanted to have their faith, and now we're discriminating against that same faith? The story is that each colony had its own denomination. Virginia was an Anglican colony. You read the original charter and it says that everything had to be done according to the ecclesiastical laws of the Church of England. So they had established the Anglican denomination. Establishment meant three things: mandatory membership of that denomination, everybody had to be a member; mandatory taxes to support that denomination, everybody had to pay taxes in Virginia to support the Anglican denomination; and you could not hold public office unless you were a member of that denomination. Now let's look at Massachusetts. Now, little background: the King of England was Henry VIII. Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones who sent Columbus to America, right? It's like a soap opera. So you got Ferdinand and Isabella, they sent Columbus to America. Ferdinand and Isabella had a daughter named Catherine. She was married to Henry VIII for 18 years, did not have a son. Henry decides to divorce her. The Pope said, no, I'm not going to recognize the divorce. And Henry says, the heck with you, I'll be my own Pope. So Henry starts the Church of England, puts himself on as the head, and goes on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. His advisors suggested that if he really wanted to break with Rome, he should stop using that Latin Bible and get himself an English Bible. So for more or less political reasons, Henry VIII spread the English Bible around the country, but something unexpected happened. People began to read it and began to compare what was in this Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives. And so this group wanted to purify the Church of England, so they were nicknamed the Puritans. Well, the king obviously didn't think he needed any purifying, thank you, so he persecuted them. There was one group that left first. They were called the Separatists. They believed in separation of church and state. So these Separatists fled to Holland, and then they fled to America, and they were going to land in Virginia and submit to this Virginia Anglican government, but they got blown off course and they landed in Massachusetts. And the captain tried to get by the shoals, but it was too stormy and it was wintertime, and the captain said, guess what, guys, you're going to have to stay here. But they said, well, we don't want to get off the boat. There's no law to submit to. And they said, well, let's come up with our own. So they wrote the first government document written in the New World called the Mayflower Compact. And how did they do it? They did it the way they did their church government in Holland. See, they didn't have a king-appointed pastor in Holland. They had William Brewster. And he said, well, when you want to make a church decision, you fast and pray, and then everybody votes. Well, when they got to Massachusetts and they're about to get off the boat, they write the Mayflower Compact, and it says, in ye presence of God, we mutually covenant ourselves together to form a civil body politic, and we agree to submit the laws that we pass. That was the beginning of our American experiment. And then that became a blueprint for our U.S. Constitution. I read through all the other colonies. The king is granting permission, King Charles I, King Charles II. This was our U.S. Constitution as we grant ourselves permission. And that's why we have our federal government. And believe it or not, the word federal is Latin for covenant. So we have a form of government that was based on a church form of government. Isn't that interesting? Roger Williams, a preacher, came over, and they didn't tolerate him, so he fled and founded Providence, Rhode Island, and he founded the First Baptist Church in America. The Puritans didn't tolerate Pastor Thomas Hooker, so he fled with his congregation and founded Hartford, Connecticut. And the Puritans not only hung witches as heretics, they hung Quakers. 4 Quakers were hung as heretics, but with the help of William Penn, the Quakers fled and founded Pennsylvania. New York was founded by the Dutch Reformed, and they did not tolerate the Lutherans and the Puritans and the Quakers. Matter of fact, the first Jews that came to America came in 1654 to New York. Actually, at the time, it was New Amsterdam. Remember Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones that sent Columbus to America? They drove the Muslims out of Spain. The Muslims had controlled Spain for 700 years. And then Ferdinand and Isabella said, well, while we're at it, we'll drive the Jews out. And 23 of them on the ship St. Catherine arrived in New Amsterdam in 1654. But it was a Dutch Reformed colony, so they didn't allow them to worship outside of their homes, didn't allow them to have a cemetery, didn't allow them to have a synagogue. They even volunteered for the militia. They were not allowed. See, because it was a Dutch Reformed colony. And Maryland was unique. It was a colony for persecuted Catholics. But they were ahead of their time. They let any Christian hold office, and more Protestants got elected and voted them out. So you had these different colonies with each one had its own preferred denomination, and they didn't get along too well, but they had to learn to work together to fight the King of England with the Revolution. After the Revolution, they said, well, you know, if you were willing to fight and die for my freedom, I need to let you have your freedom. And it began this thing called tolerance. At first, it was just with Protestants. 98% of the country was Protestant in 1776. A little less than 2% was Catholic, and around 0.1% were Jewish. Massachusetts Constitution, 1780, written by John Adams, says that the state may lay a tax for public Protestant teachers of piety and religion. Now, we think, boy, that was real narrow-minded. They thought it was a step ahead because just prior to then, you had to be an Anglican Protestant or a Congregational Protestant. Now, 4 states in 1776 allowed Catholics to hold office. One was Maryland. They said all you had to do was be a Christian. That Christian meant Catholics or Protestants. The other was Pennsylvania. William Penn wrote the Constitution of Pennsylvania that said all you had to do was believe in the divine authority of the Old and New Testament to hold office. And so you can see you drop a pebble in the pond, the ripples go out. So first in Maryland, right before the Revolution, it was Anglican. Then it went out to Christian, and then it went out to Jewish, and then it went out to just believing in a monotheistic God and so forth. Believe it or not, the 2002 Constitution of Maryland still requires all office holders to make a declaration of belief in God. Now, the ACLU's had a fit and says, well, you can't enforce it, but the federal government cannot force Maryland to change its state constitution. Religion was under state's jurisdiction. It's like a racetrack with 13 lanes. Every state was in charge of religion for their state, and they advanced it at different speeds. They passed the 14th Amendment to give rights to freed slaves. But this was the federal government telling the states what to do. The federal courts, the Supreme Court, used the 14th Amendment to take religion out of states' jurisdiction. And now, from 1947 on, the federal government's in charge of religion, and they've broadened it to tolerate secular humanists, ethical culture, and atheists. And the last ones in have decided to kick the first ones out. So Newsweek magazine had a poll, and the poll was September 2005. Newsweek magazine said 85% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. 52% Protestant, 24% Catholic, 2% Jewish, 1% Muslim, 0.5% Hindu, 0.5% Buddhist, and only 1% atheist. I thought, this is currently only 1% of Americans identify themselves as atheists, and 87% identify themselves as Judeo-Christian, according to Newsweek. And I thought, what do you call it when 1% forces its will on 87%? It's a tyranny. It's a judicial tyranny.